Some creative and inspirational people may not be heard in a very literal sense. We literally did not hear from the young woman after an early childhood of divorce and abuse she associates with her anxiety disorder known as selective mutism. We sure heard from Maya Angelou later on as a prolific poet, memoirist, and civil rights activist. Other creative and inspirational people may mostly be heard after their deaths. Think Galileo, Mendel, Van Gogh, Bach, Thoreau, Edgar Allan Poe, Oscar Wilde, Emily Dickinson, and so many more less well-known figures. Still, other creative and inspirational people are not fully heard. The stories they tell may be distorted or not fully attributed to them because an imbalanced society's oppressive constraints will not lift their voices high enough. Think about all those women activists, for instance, whose social voices, creativity, and leadership are only now beginning to be recognized. Dorothy Height, president of the National Council of Negro Women, who stood on the platform with Martin Luther King during the March on Washington, said, "We could not get women's participation taken seriously." And what about Pauli Murray, the gender nonconforming Episcopal priest and legal scholar who coined the term Jane Crow for the sex discrimination black women faced? Her book, States' Laws on Race and Color, is the Bible of the 1954 Supreme Court ruling declaring separate public schools for black and white students unconstitutional. Hey, and while we're at it, Rosa Parks wasn't some accidental hero as often portrayed. She wasn't a frail little thing whose feet hurt. No, she was a lifelong activist for racial justice who held many prominent and relevant positions of leadership. Listen to and read their stories now. We do not necessarily know when what we say will be heard. We do not necessarily know when or which of our creations will inspire. We do not necessarily know which story we tell will resonate with the power of transformation. Continue to speak, continue to create. You will be heard, you will inspire, your transformative stories will resonate. We are called to serve our human race, are we not, Unitarian Universalists? As you are called by our second principle to promote justice, equity, and compassion in human relations, I sure know you to have many stories. You inspire me. Let your being, your spirit, flow into a space of both broad storytelling and even broader story listening. Mandy McGlynn describes herself as a superqueer Jew whose vocation is focused on spiritual care for those unaffiliated with or underserved by institutional religion. She contributes to UUA Worship Web Library. She believes that all our stories are sacred. Her prayer of storytelling describes many of the names a deity may be called, recognizes that narratives of our nation span a spectrum of reality, and confirms that stories about our very self may be buried, she says, too deep in our souls for us to even recognize them. Excerpting, she bids, God of discovery, help us find the strength to excavate those buried stories. Let us lean on one another as we brush them off, hold them up to the light, and find their meaning and use. May our roots nourish us so that we might grow abundantly and flower into blessings for one another and for the world. Please light your palpable or spiritual chalice as I light mine, for the lot of both our heard and yet to be heard stories.
This song we sing is our heart's prayer to you, O God of peace. Please send your dove, your spirit of love, to help our torment cease. The world is tired of war and blood and fear. The tears we've cried, the pain inside, oh Spirit, draw us near. So keep us true to our heart's vow, to show the world your love. May pious wane and joy remain as we sing to you above. We pray, O God, you take away our fear, the tears we've cried, the pain inside, oh Spirit, draw us near. We pray, O God, you take away our fear, the tears we've cried, the pain inside, oh Spirit, draw us near.
Good morning, and thank you for joining us for worship. On behalf of the Unitarian Universalist Community Church of Santa Monica, I welcome you. My name is Leon Henderson McLennan, and I am your worship associate for this morning. I'm delighted to be joined by Reverend Ranwa Hammamy, our guest minister preaching today. Reverend Hammamy serves as the Executive Director of the Unitarian Universalist Justice Ministry of California, which supports UUs around the state in their various justice missions by providing advocacy, education, and witness opportunities to live out our UU values. Ranwa has previously served as president of DRUM, Diversity and Revolutionary Unitarian Universalist Multicultural Ministries, a national organization for UU people of color. A self-described UU Muslim, Ranwa seeks to serve both living traditions in her ministry, encouraging others both to grow and learn from each other's gifts. When not working, Ranwa enjoys spending time baking absurd concoctions, singing for liberation, and relaxing with their spouse and 5 fur babies. I am also pleased to be joined by Director of Religious Exploration Cleo Anderson, Director of Music Sonder Choi, Ryan Humphreys on the piano, and vocalist Michael Meersma, Javon Haskin, and Chloe Vaught. A special thank you goes out to Pam Teplitz, Liz Fuller, and Eileen McCormick in production, and an ever-growing cast of wonderful, talented members and friends, including Carl Lisowski and Leslie Kernigan, who make our distance worship possible. A hearty thanks also goes out to all minding the worship and production processes, while leaders, including our developmental minister, Reverend Jeremiah Callanday, are out on well-deserved vacations. Unitarian Universalism is not defined by creed or dogma, but guided by principles that affirm the worth and dignity of every person and encourage an individual search for truth and meaning. We honor the wonder and mystery of our lives and affirm that we are all connected to one another and to the interdependent web of life. Our tradition arises from scripture and science, nature and philosophy, personal experience and ancient traditions. We are a welcoming community, inclusive of people of all gender identities, sexual orientations, races, ethnicities, and social locations. We invite you to join us in creating this beloved community we share with each other and the larger world. Move with us beyond the boundaries of distance and place and into our gathered religious community this morning. A few brief announcements. Please send your joys and concerns to pastoralcare@uusm.org. Betty Barclay and Linda Van Lichten lead this integral service and are here for us all. We hold in our hearts both the unspoken joys and the unspoken concerns with you at this moment. I'm impressed with all we offer to our community during these challenging and physically distant times. There's an elementary art class today from 10:45 a.m. to noon. If you catch me here on the chat stream before the end of the service, I can help you attend the Zoom meeting class taught by Katie Sayers. There are open meditation Wellspring Zoom meetings Monday 7:30 p.m. to 9 p.m., as well as Wednesday and Friday noon to 1 p.m. Please email meditation@uusm.org for more information. And the UU Men's Group is meeting Thursday 7:30 p.m. to 9 p.m. via Zoom. The topics include: how are you handling aging? What are some of the advantages and disadvantages of growing older? As well as related material. Please email adultre@uusm.org. Refer to the emailed announcements for next Sunday's Green Committee and a week from Tuesday's board meetings as well. In these times, it is more important than ever to call someone just to say hello and be in community. And reach out to our Minister Emeritus, for instance, Reverend Ernie Pipes. He is well, I'm still informed. Please keep your eyes on the newsletter, e-blasts, announcements, and upcoming events, and the website for updates. Love is the doctrine of this church. The quest for truth is its sacrament, and service is its prayer. To dwell together in peace, to seek knowledge in freedom, to serve humankind in fellowship, thus do we covenant with each other.
From all that dwell below the skies, let songs of hope and faith arise. Let peace, goodwill on earth be sung through every land by every tongue.
Good morning. Today's story is about a theater troupe. Now, this theater troupe was a community theater troupe. And every summer, Miss Ethel would go to her bookshelves and pull off a big, dusty 3-ring binder filled with all sorts of shows. Now, Miss Ethel had written a lot of these shows over the years, and they were easily changeable if needed. Change a costume here, change the key to a song there. But they were all written from the perspective of Miss Ethel. Now, one May, Miss Ethel broke her ankle. And that makes getting around pretty hard, so she actually decided to take the summer off and let her assistant, Jody, run the show for the summer, while she went to go visit her sister out of town so she could be taken care of and let her ankle heal up. And so she packed up a few important things, hopped on the road, and drove off. Well, was driven off. And so Jody walked into the office and looked to where the 3-ring binder was, and it was gone. She tried calling Miss Ethel, but, well, she was on her way up a mountain. She wasn't going to have service. But Jody needed to have a show. She thought, what do I do? What do I do? So she called up a few people who'd been on the show before and said, hey, do you think we could write a show? A few of them said, well, why wouldn't we just call Miss Ethel and get hers? And Jody said, well, I'm supposed to be in charge, and I kind of don't want her to know that we misplaced the binder. And so everyone agreed. And so Jody picked a setting, which was the beach, and Michael, the sound guy, he picked a plot, which was a madcap summer adventure with a summer camp staff. And different people added in songs. Some of the light guys even created story pieces that were all with lighting. And guess what? It was a sold-out show. Little kids wanted to see it because there were lights and new songs. Parents wanted to see it because their kids were enrolled that they'd never had a chance to be in before. And then Miss Ethel saw all the clippings and all the pictures. She called Jody. Jody was a little nervous. But Miss Ethel said, you all by yourselves, took all your different talents, all of these different things, your lighting ideas, and your settings, and your sewing skills, and your musical skills, and you created something far bigger than my dusty old binder ever could. I am so proud of you. And the moral of this story, is that lots of different voices working all together can create such a rich experience beyond anything you've seen before.
Oh, we give thanks for this precious day, for all gathered here and those far away, for this time we share with love and care. Oh, we give thanks for this precious day. Oh, we give thanks for this precious day, for all gathered here and those far away, for this time we share with love and care. Oh, we give thanks for this precious day.
Beloveds, as we enter into our time of shared meditation and prayer, I invite you to breathe with me. Breathing in, breathing out. I invite you to take one more breath with me, with all of us, knowing that as we watch this together, we are all connected in this sacred act of shared breath. As we breathe in, breathe out, accepting those gifts that come to us without our asking, and releasing back out into the world what we have to offer. Spirit of life, source of love abundant. There are so many questions on our hearts and minds today. There are so many worries, so many uncertainties. Spirit of love, Spirit of compassion and mercy, in these times where we don't know what comes next, help us feel your presence surrounding us, supporting us, flowing within us. Source of abundant love, help us feel you in a phone call from a friend. Help us feel you in a grocery delivery from a neighbor. Help us feel you in those moments when we can come together virtually or in a safe distance from one another, to know that we're not alone. Spirit of life, source of love abundant that flows within each and every one of us. In these times when our world is breaking and breaking open, help us make that love abundant become real with our own hands, our own minds, our bodies, and our hearts. Help us make that love abundant become real in this world so that we can cultivate a just world where the lives of all are seen as holy and sacred, where there is no discriminate violence against Black and brown lives, where our earth is cared for and treasured as the incredible gift that it is, where we care for one another. Spirit of life, source of love abundant that flows within and between us. In this time of breaking and breaking open, help us be co-creators of a world we know is possible. In your names, known, unknown, and never to be known, we pray. Amen. Our reading this morning is by Moja Koff. Haja writes a letter to Sarah as a cathartic exercise suggested by her therapist in her collection Hagar Poems. Dear Sarah, life made us enemies, but it doesn't have to be that way. What if we both ditched the old man? He could have visitation rights with the boys, alternate weekends and holidays, especially the Feast of the Sacrifice. He took that day anyway, forgetting it was about me in the desert, watching my baby dehydrate near to death. Anyway, you and we'd set up house, raise the kids, start a catering business maybe. You have brains. So do I. We could travel. There are places to see besides Ur and this nowheresville desert with its tribes of hooligans. No, your lips thin when you disapprove, like the mother I almost remember from before I wound up in your house. I was barely more than a girl. You used to laugh then. In those days, you could stand to look at me. We even hugged sometimes. Oh, Sarah, you need years of therapy. Can't you admit that what he did was wrong? Be angry at him for just 1 second. You don't have to be angry forever. Just long enough to know the world won't fall apart. Long enough to pity him, yourself, me. Laugh, Sarah, laugh. Imagine God, the possibility. Sincerely, love, Hajar. I recently heard someone call the year 2020 the Great Reckoning. And the more I sat with that name, the more it made sense. The combination of multiple catastrophes coming to a head, our humanity-driven climate crisis, the COVID-19 pandemic exacerbated by inequitable healthcare systems, and the centuries-long racist violence against Black and brown lives in this country, the combination has brought to our mainstream attention just how much we as a society and as a world desperately need to acknowledge and address. Now, for some of us, these realities have long been a part of our awareness, if not our own lived experience. Now, for all of us, these realities are undeniable and at the forefront of our lives and our future. And as part of this great reckoning, our leaders, our institutions, and our societies are being once again called upon to acknowledge essential and challenging truths about our pasts and the impact they have on our lives in the present and future. See, these last 8 months, we as a society have received an abundance of invitations, and frankly, with more patience than perhaps we have earned, to re-examine the stories we tell of our history and the narratives we choose to glorify and memorialize. We as a society have received an abundance of invitations to expand our collective awareness and now listen to and center the experiences, histories, and stories that have been denied through erasure, sugarcoating, and genocide. Those are harsh words, and they are true ones. There are sides to our collective story, the story of our world, our country, our humanity, that have for too long gone unacknowledged. In this great reckoning, we are being invited to do the hard work of learning those new stories so that we can begin to undo and heal from the harm our old stories continue to cause. And to do this learning and healing work, this holy, sacred soul work, we as a society and as a tradition must commit ourselves to listening to and amplifying the stories and experiences that have not been historically centered or even told. We must come to an understanding that the majority narrative that many of us grew up in doesn't tell the whole story, and that there are more perspectives out there that complexify and expand our collective story. Because when we open ourselves up to those truths that have sometimes been whispered and more recently screaming to be heard, we open ourselves up to not only an understanding of the harm and the suffering and the tragedy they bring to our collective story, we also open ourselves up to the wisdom, the faith, the perseverance, the creativity, the possibility that they weave into our shared narrative. We expand our collective story not only in the telling of our past, but in the imagining of our future. And so today, I would like to invite you into a story that is not often centered or told. In much of Western and particularly American discourse on the Islamic traditions, there is an almost exclusive focus on the role of Prophet Muhammad. And this makes sense. His teachings are central to virtually all interpretations of the Islamic traditions. Going a little bit further, we often see that when we talk about the Islamic traditions in interfaith contexts, it's often grouped together as one of the Abrahamic faiths, alongside Judaism and Christianity, as all of them have some version of the Abraham stories in their sacred texts. Now, growing up, I was taught that Abraham, or Ibrahim in Arabic, was like Muhammad, an example of how to be a good Muslim. He was, and still is, often lifted up in many strands of the Islamic traditions as someone who exhibits an unshakable faith. And one of the stories that is often used to describe the power of his faith and submission to God is one that also exists, though with some differences, in the Jewish and Christian teachings: his willingness to sacrifice his own son to God. In the Islamic traditions, it is commonly shared that Ibrahim was told by God that he must sacrifice his son Ishmael to demonstrate the obedience of his faith. When Ibrahim tells his son Ishmael of this command, Ishmael is described as consenting to the sacrifice of his own life to God. Now, while this first part varies to an extent from Jewish and Christian versions of the story, the ending is largely the same. An angel intervenes before Ishmael is killed and says both his and Ibrahim's faith has been proven as strong, and instead they sacrifice a ram or a goat. Now, like I said, I grew up hearing this story as an example of how to be an obedient person, a good Muslim. After the Prophet Muhammad, Ibrahim and Ishmael were the pinnacles of what it meant to have real faith. But, as I'm sure is the case with many of you hearing this story in this moment, that example never really sat right with me. This narrative that I had been raised in felt at best incomplete, and at worst harmful and dangerous. And because I realized that there is at least one person missing from that story. One experience, one perspective that isn't centered. But it should be, if there is to be any learning and healing to be done. And that perspective is the perspective of Ishmael's mother and one of Ibrahim's wives, Hagar or Hajar. Now, in many Judeo-Christian contexts, Hajar or Hagar is more often than not described through the lens of her relationship with Abraham and the ways in which she and their child were presented as tests of his faith. But she is much, 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 much more than that. A reality that Black womanist theologians in the Christian traditions like Dolores Williams have been lifting up for generations, and what Muslima feminist and liberation theologians have also described in their analysis and engagement of the Islamic traditions. Now, in Judeo-Christian tellings of the story, Hagar is described as being anywhere from a slave to a second wife to a surrogate mother when Sarah is not able to conceive a child with Ibrahim. In the Islamic traditions, more emphasis is placed on the second wife story. Now, as those majority narratives around Hajar go in the Islamic traditions, she was married to Ibrahim, as was Sarah. And Hajar was the first to have a child in that relationship. And this obviously changed her relationship with Ibrahim and even with Sarah. And then, when her son was still an infant, something else happened that would change the course of Hajar's life. According to majority narratives in the Islamic traditions, Ibrahim was told by God to bring Hajar and her child, her infant child Ishmael, to a barren spot in the desert and leave them there, with nothing more than some water and some dates. The story, as I was taught as a child, was that when Ibrahim turned to leave Hajar and her child in the desert, Hajar repeatedly asked him, "Why are you leaving us? Why are you leaving us? Why are you leaving us?" And every single time, he didn't respond. It was only when she asked him, "Did God tell you to bring us here?" did Ibrahim reply with a simple yes. Hajar then responded, "Then go. God will protect us." Eventually, the little bit of water and dates that Hajar had with her, they ran out, and soon she could no longer provide milk for her son. I cannot even begin to imagine what she felt like in that moment, thirsty, hungry, with her young child wailing in her arms. Nothing and no one around her but arid desert. But what happens next in her story does tell me a little bit about what she might have been thinking when she said, "Then go. God will protect us." Hajar began to search for water in the desert. She placed her child on the ground and began running back and forth, searching between two large hills in the area. She searched for any sign of water or nourishment that would help her and her baby survive. Eventually, an angel appears to Hajar and tells her that her faith in God is to be rewarded. And he shows her a spring of fresh water flowing right next to her infant son's heel. Now, what Hajar does in this moment of discovery demonstrates her imagination, her creativity, and her foresight. She not only drank from that spring of water and shared it with her child, she created a well around that spring. She knew exactly what she was doing. She was preserving and maintaining access to its life force, and not just for her and her son. She lived in a nomadic world, and so she knew that she would have travelers eventually passing through her little spot in the desert, and she would be able to trade some of the water for more food and supplies to survive in that previously desolate spot. And that is exactly what happened in her story. Hajar and her son Ishmael not only survived in the desert because of her perseverance and creativity, they thrived. Travelers not only passed through this place, some of them stayed, and a town, an entire city, grew around them. A city that began when one woman, one single mother, acted, created, and imagined in spite of the odds she was facing, motivated by her firmly held faith in the promise of God's protection. The name of that city, as some of you may have figured out, is Mecca. Now, none of us were there when Ibrahim left Hajar and her son in the desert. But what I like to imagine is that Hajar embodied an attitude of grief, anger, and resilience that was captured by the poem we heard by Moja Kaf today. The moment she found out that Ibrahim believed that God told him to leave a woman and her child in the desert, I love imagining her reaction being the equivalent of, boy, bye, I'm better off without you, and I know I've got something better looking out for me too. I imagine that in the middle of the fear and confusion of being left to potentially die in the desert, that she is unapologetic in her anger at how Ibrahim was treated her, and says, then go, knowing that there is a greater promise of protection waiting, that deep down she knows she is worthy of. And Hajar didn't just wait for that promise of protection. Her belief that God would protect her and her infant son didn't cause her to become a passive victim waiting to be saved in her circumstances. Instead, her belief in that promise moved her to do the opposite. Hajar takes action, rooted in her anger, rooted in her faith, rooted in her awareness of the danger she was facing, and rooted in her ingenuity. And knowing that to experience that promise, she had a part to play in helping to create it. Hajar's faith didn't tell her to wait. Her faith told her to act. Her faith tells her that she herself is integral to that promise of protection. And in her decision to claim her part, claim her power, she not only finds water to survive a day or two, she uses that water to create tools and strategies that she needs to thrive in the desert. She innovates, she provides for herself and her son, she makes connections and builds a mutually supportive community, an early mutual aid network in the desert that not only allows herself but many more to eventually call this spot home. When Hajar told Abraham to go because God would protect her and her child, she wasn't a woman submitting to abandonment. She was a woman who chose to help make a promise real by living into her greatest capacities for resilience, creativity, imagination, and hope. Now, I like to believe that this part of Hajar's story adds to our collective story about our potential as people and as communities. Hajar is a woman in a patriarchal society, left stranded in the desert with her child, a promise, and her faith, and her creative power. A power that resides within each and every one of us to imagine, persevere, and create, and not just to survive, but to thrive. Those are gifts that we can demonstrate or surprise ourselves with every day. Whether it's by coming up with our 37th recipe to use our sourdough starter discard, or by managing a full-time job while suddenly tasked with homeschooling your children. I believe that inherent to our faith's affirmation of an individual's free and responsible search for truth and meaning, there is a promise of our innate, creative, and resilient potential. And accessing that potential, strengthening and growing it, it is an act that needs to happen in community. Hajar's story, her creativity, her ingenuity, and her power, it wasn't simply shown by her running between two hills and creating a makeshift well. The promise she believed in came into full fruition when she collaborated with others to make it so. She didn't just go from surviving to thriving on her own. She did so in community with others who helped make that promise of protection come true for all of them. That, to me, sounds like the universal salvation that our Universalist predecessors imagined. A world where everyone experiences the promise of an abundant love, created here on earth with our hands and our hearts. So what does any of this have to do with that incomplete story of Abraham's sacrifice? Knowing Hajar's story, opening ourselves up to her perspective, complexifies things. And yeah, maybe the story of the attempted sacrifice isn't actually all that great. What if we just own it? Parts of it kind of suck. And what if we used our reading from Moshe Kaf as an invitation to imagine Hajar's perspective on the whole thing? In her poem, Kaf imagines Hajar going one more step in her creativity and resilience. She imagines the promise that Hajar imagined, a better world, not just for her, but for Sarah and their two sons. In this imagining of Hajar's perspective, we not only see her believing in the promise of a better world, but believing in a path to it. And inviting Sarah, despite their broken relationship, to join her. Out of the pain and anger, she still knew it doesn't have to be that way. Hajar writes this letter to Sarah about their circumstances, naming both truths that challenge and possibilities that invite. What if we both ditched the old man? We could travel. We don't have to be angry forever, just long enough to know the world won't fall apart. Imagine God, the possibility. Imagine us making God's promise come true. See, that's the part of the story that almost always doesn't get told. And that's the story we need. The imagination, the possibility. That's the promise of water in the desert that we will miss if we hold too tightly to the old story. But if we let something new in, if we open ourselves up to searching for something, maybe we will find that water that has been calling to us all along. In this year's Great Reckoning, Hajar is writing that letter to all of us who have felt some inkling that something is wrong, but unsure of what we can do about it. We are being invited to join her in the desert, to partner with her in that perseverant search for water, its preservation, its cultivation into the sacred promise of something more. Like Hajar to Sarah, who was also a woman living in a deeply patriarchal society, we all hold an invitation to collectively imagine. And we are being called to challenge and grow beyond what we know. We are also being invited to remember the creativity and the resilience within each and every one of us, and to know that it doesn't have to be like this. We are being invited to play our part and manifesting that promise of the divine, sacred moral arc of the universe that bends towards justice with love. And what do those calls look like? Those calls, they look like calls to recognize the environmental degradation and the ways in which our complacency has left our children and grandchildren to an uncertain future. They look like calls to actively obstruct pipeline construction, to divest from funds that are heavily rooted in oil production, to prioritize ecological preservation and follow the lead of Indigenous climate activists. These are all calls for us to collectively nurture that sacred promise within all of us to create something new. These calls to our promise, these are calls to defund the police, to abolish immigration and customs enforcement, to abolish prisons and end the slavery-preserving systems of policing and incarceration that we have in this country. They are calls to invest in practices and systems of restorative justice, to support community, health, and education services that care for the whole person. These are all calls for us to collectively nurture that sacred promise within all of us to create something new. These calls of this promise, they are calls for universal health care, income and housing, calls for an end to predatory capitalistic and economic practices that rely on keeping a subset of our human siblings in abhorrent, virtually inescapable poverty. These are all calls for us to collectively nurture that sacred promise within all of us to create something new. Hajar didn't know what promise of protection she would receive or what it would look like when Ibrahim walked away. She didn't know where the water would be. She didn't know if there would be water. But she knew she would be protected. And she took action, rooted in that belief that something would be created out of her choices to believe. And my faith moves me to do the same. My faith is why I am serving in my role as the executive director of your Unitarian Universalist Justice Ministry of California. It's why we as an organization are committed to supporting Unitarian Universalists like you, working to help make our faith's promise real. It's why we as an organization put our support behind the people and communities whose stories deepen our understanding of our past and expand our imagination of our future. It's why I'm here live streaming to you in the middle of our great reckoning. Because I believe in our faith's promise. I believe in us. And this past week, I've seen not just glimpses, but full-on virtual billboards of our faith's promise being made real. For the last several days, your Unitarian Universalist Justice Ministry of California has been hosting our usually in-person Justice Leadership Summit online. As an organization and gathered community, we chose to lean into the reality of our desert and create a virtual experience that connects UUs across California in ways only a virtual conference can. Watching UUs phone bank to UU the vote for the first, the second, and then the third time in their lives, creating space for members of congregations hundreds of miles away to share strategies about how to fund immigrant relief programs, attending statewide virtual screenings of documentaries on voting rights, seeing people be charged and recharged to create a world centered on love. This past week of workshops and community was our search for and our manifestation of that promise of water in the desert. These days, we are in a uniquely challenging, isolating, and frightening desert. And we are facing one of the most creative moments of our lives. If we are willing to open ourselves up to the truths that they hold and the possibilities they invite, we can feel our faith's promise of water in this desert if we commit ourselves to creating it.
Edward Estlin Cummings was born to a well-known Unitarian couple in Cambridge, Massachusetts. E.E. told many stories in many forms, you know. Paraphrasing one of his prayers, I thank the divine for most this amazing day, for leaping greenly spirits of trees and a blue, true dream of sky, and for everything which is natural, which is infinite, which is yes. It is in this spirit of making space for personal reflection and environmental stewardship I invite Carl Lasovsky and Leslie Kernigan to tell their stories and invite you for generous giving now.
We come together for more than ourselves. During the month of August, 50% of this congregation's offertory will go to Camp de Benneville Pines, our church retreat in the San Bernardino Mountains that we share with UU congregations across the Southwest.
UU Santa Monica members have been going to Benneville Pines for many years, finding respite from the LA chaotic life for a week or a weekend, hiking, singing, and meditating under the Jeffrey Pines that surround the camp.
My family and I have been going to camp for years now, since our kids were really little. The kids love it, the freedom, the fun up there. The grown-ups like the enjoyment, the relaxation, the community, singing, eating, playing cards, all that stuff.
I've been going since I was about 12. I have very fond memories of it, and recently I've gotten to go and be an adult support for the youth-led campusry as well, which is a treat.
However, because of COVID-19, this year the Benneville Pines has been virtually empty. Yet, it still does cost money to run the place. Quite a bit of money, actually. And camp is quickly exhausting its reserves. So churches like ours are stepping up to help save this precious resource. Camp Director Janet James says that if each church can just contribute through donations what it normally contributes through reservations and registrations, camp will survive.
There are 3 ways to give. You can mail a check to the church office.
You can make a donation, use the Make a Donation link on the uusm.org webpage, or a good way to donate is using your smartphone. Text 844-982-0209, then in the body of the text, enter a dollar amount, a space, and then GCC, which stands for Generous Congregation Contribution. So, for example, you might enter 20 GCC for a $20 donation. On your first time, you will be asked to set it up, but after that, it'll be easy. Again,
the number is 844-982-0209.
easy text giving makes a big difference. So your donation, whatever amount, is gratefully
appreciated.
And
we're going to do a concert.
Speaking of fundraisers,
Yes.
Friday, September 18th, which would be the first night of our camp, our family retreat at the camp, Leslie Kernigan and I'll be Kai Landauer that night.
Yeah.
We're going to do a short four-song concert.
Featuring his music and several other very, very talented artists.
Yes, and Leslie Kernigan's very talented too.
So we hope to see you there.
Friday, September 18th. Thanks, and don't forget to donate.
Camp to Bonneville!
I've got peace like a river, I've got peace like a river. I've got peace like a river in my soul. I've got peace like a river, I've got peace like a river. I've got peace like a river in my soul. I've got joy like a fountain, I've got joy like a fountain. I've got joy like a fountain in my soul. I've got joy like a fountain, I've got joy like a fountain. I've got joy like a fountain in my soul. I've got love like an ocean, I've got love like an ocean. I've got love like an ocean in my soul. I've got love like an ocean, I've got love like an ocean. I've got love like an ocean in my soul. I've got strength like a mountain, I've got strength like a mountain. I've got strength like a mountain in my soul. I've got strength like a mountain. I've got strength like a mountain. I've got strength like a mountain in my soul.
Beloveds, as we go from this virtual space and into our week, I remind you that within each and every one of us, we hold a promise. Go forward into the world carrying that promise and using it to create something new. Go forward into the world carrying that promise, sharing it with the promise that others hold within them, and create a world where love is at the center.